What's up everybody? So in this video we're going to be talking about everything that you need to know regarding cellular respiration. That's a word and a half, right? So basically, in a nutshell, cell respiration is the process by which our cells make ATP or energy for our body, the currency of our body, which is ATP. Without ATP, we cannot do anything. Now, to explain this, I want to start off with this analogy, and I think it's a great analogy. We start off here with Mike Tyson, right? He comes into the store, he's a boxer, right? World famous boxer. He can knock people out any day of the week. So he comes in because he wants to buy new gloves. His old ones are all worn out. So he comes in here with his dollars and he realizes, oh damn, I can't buy them. These are big brain dollars. It's a different currency. This store uses a different currency than his traditional dollars. So what does he have to do? Because his dollars are wrong. Although it's money, although it's valuable, it's the wrong currency. It's not going to work here. So he has to exchange it for big brain dollars. So that's what he does. He goes to this machine, he exchanges it for big brain dollars. So now he has the correct currency. Okay, now he can buy these gloves. So why did I tell you this story? Why did I tell you this analogy? Because our body works very, very similarly. Let me show you. So when we eat, let's say, what's your favorite food? So for mine, I love burgers. So let's say we eat burgers. When we're hungry, we eat burgers because we need it, because our body needs it for energy, right? Otherwise, we'll die. Now, interestingly, this burger is technically not the correct currency for our cells. This burger is way too big. It will never fit into our cells. Our cells can't use the burger in as a whole as energy. It's the wrong currency. Just like the dollars was the wrong currency when Mike Tyson tried to buy the gloves. So what our body does first is it breaks down this burger into smaller pieces, right? So we call that digestion. Our digestive system, like our stomach, like our intestines, and a lot of enzymes and all that will break it down into smaller pieces, what it's made of. So for example, little amino acids, glucose, all those little monomers, right? Because we know we have fats, we have carbohydrates, we have proteins, we have nucleic acids. So it's going to break it down into those components. So now they're small enough to be absorbed into our body, right? So we're just going to use glucose here as the example. Obviously, this could be amino acids, could be lipids, but glucose is the most common, so let's use it. So now we've broken down that burger into glucose, a small enough version to be absorbed into our body, but this is also not the right currency. Our cell does not use glucose to pay for things. It does not use glucose itself to make everything happen. So we're not quite there yet. So now we're still in the wrong currency. So now we're going to do, what your body is going to do, is convert it into the correct currency with a process called cellular respiration. So we're going to turn this glucose into the correct currency, just like Mike Tyson used this little machine to turn his dollars into the correct currency, the big brain dollars, okay? So what do we need to convert this glucose into the correct currency? And first of all, what is the correct currency? I just mentioned, right? The correct currency is going to be ATP. ATP is the correct currency. Our cell uses this for so many things, and we'll look at that very shortly. Now, cell respiration, as you'll see when we talk about the details in this video, occurs in the cytoplasm and also the mitochondria. Both of these places are involved, okay? So it's going to use the mitochondria plays a very important role. So this ATP now is going to be our big brain dollars. It's going to be the correct currency, and our cell can finally use this as money to pay for all the things to happen, okay? That's the point. So I hope that analogy makes it make sense, okay? So that's all that cell respiration does. It turns our glucose, which is the wrong currency, into ATP, which is the correct currency that our body can actually use. Okay? Now, as for an actual definition for you guys, if we had to put it formally, cell respiration is the gradual breakdown of nutrient molecules such as glucose. See, it doesn't just have to be glucose. It can be fatty acids and other things. In a series of reactions that ultimately release energy in the form of ATP. Okay, great. So just know we use glucose because it's the most common, and they always use glucose when they teach it. So hopefully that makes sense. So now let's talk a little bit about ATP, because so we know now that cell respiration basically makes us this correct currency called ATP that our cell can use. So what exactly can ATP do? Basically everything. Let me show you. So first, let's look at ATP in terms of its structure. Okay, here we go. We look at its structure. So this here, you don't need to know how to draw this, okay? Just recognize it for now. It's just to make you understand this. So ATP has three key components, okay? Adenine, okay, here. Remember from DNA, right? You have the four bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, the A, C, T, and G, the nucleotides. See, this adenine here is used, okay? So adenine, the A base, is used in ATP. And then we got the sugar, the ribose here, the ribose sugar. And then instead of one phosphate, like in adenine, like in DNA, the adenine, we actually have now three phosphates, okay? Three phosphates. So that's where the name comes from if we look at the name. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine triphosphate, okay? So now, what is the difference? So we can see here that ATP is one, adenosine triphosphate. ADP is the same structure, but only two phosphates. So notice, 1, 2, that would be ADP. ATP is 3 phosphates. So what's going on here? So basically, this bond here connecting the phosphates to each other, they are high energy bond. Inside these bonds is stored a lot of energy. So if we can remove this energy, then that will allow things to happen inside our cells. This is where the energy is stored in ATP. The energy is stored in this little special bond here, this high energy bond. So basically, when we turn ATP into ADP, and essentially using ATP, when we use ATP, we turn it into ADP, so we remove one phosphate, and now we're left with ADP, so adenosine diphosphate, and then the other phosphate, and then we removed that available energy in that bond, right? Because this bond here, and in ATP, has a lot of stored energy. So when we break down ATP into ADP, when we break that bond, we now freed up a lot of available energy, and our cell uses that energy to drive certain things to happen, okay? Certain very important things to happen. So we're going to look at what those things are very shortly. So don't worry about drawing this structure. In a nutshell, I just wanted to show you physically what the difference is between how ATP looks like and ADP. So ATP has the 3 phosphates, ADP has 2 phosphates, and this high energy bond is really important because it has a lot of stored energy. So if we break this bond, that energy gets released and can be used for all these functions, which we're going to mention just now. Now, I want to highlight something real quick for you guys. So the process of breaking this bond, turning ATP into ADP, is known as a exergonic reaction, okay? An exergonic reaction is a sort of reaction where we release energy, okay? When we release energy stored inside a certain bond. So here we had this energy stored inside this bond. We break that bond to release the energy, so it's exergonic. That's a reaction that releases energy, which can now be available to do a bunch of functions. The opposite direction, so when we take something and we put it together to store the energy inside the bond, so right now there's no energy, but when we put these two together, now we stored energy inside that bond again. So that is the opposite, and it's called an endergonic reaction. By doing so, we store the energy in a bond now, which can now in the future be used again to release energy for some kind of function. So that's very important. So that's how ATP is like our money. That's where the energy is stored, in that special high energy bond, okay? Now, what are some functions that can happen? Let me show you. So one key one, which you guys may already know, is membrane transport. When we learned about membrane transport, we know that sometimes we have passive membrane transport where molecules just move down a gradient passively, no energy required, no ATP required. But in some scenarios, we need to move these molecules against their concentration gradient from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. Sometimes that is needed. Now that is not passive, that is not natural, that requires ATP. So ATP is going to go to that little machine there, and it's going to go give it the available energy to allow that to happen. Okay, that's one way in which ATP is useful. So another way is synthesizing macromolecules. So basically anabolism. Remember, anabolism is when you put smaller molecules together to form a big molecule. This is the opposite of catabolism. Remember, catabolism sounds like cat, where you break molecules apart. So anabolism, because cats like to destroy things, as we all know. Now, anabolism is the opposite. You're forming molecules. So to form molecules, to put them together to form a bigger molecule, sometimes ATP is required, where it's going to go and it's going to go turn into ADP, and release that energy that can now be used to supply the energy to make those two smaller molecules become a bigger molecule. Okay, that's second example. Third, movement of a cell. For example, some of our cells, like the sperm, have a flagellum, a little tail, and that's going to do all the swimming. Think about it. Have you ever tried swimming? Damn, it's hard. You need energy. It takes effort, right? So the same way here, it doesn't just happen for free. So we need ATP. So ATP will be there. There will be a lot of mitochondria in this little sperm to make all that ATP. To use it so that the tail can wiggle and waggle so it can swim. Okay, so even that requires ATP. Again, the ATP will come, break into ADP, and release all that energy so that that movement can occur. Okay, and another one that you need to know is cell component movement. So we just talked about the movement of an entire cell using that flagella to move the cell around. Now we're talking about inside the cell. Inside your cell, a lot of things need to move around to get to where they gotta be to make certain things happen. So for example, one example is mitosis. In mitosis, you need to split the cell apart. So first you need to duplicate the DNA and then split the DNA into two separate cells, right? So how does the DNA move around inside your cell? That's important. There's a lot of components that can help that happen in your cell, a lot of tools that causes these movements to happen, but they require ATP. So ATP will come, break down into ADP, release that available energy so that that particular action can happen. So in this slide, what I want you to take away is understand the difference between the structure of ATP and ADP, and know that ATP gets broken down into ADP and releases some available energy, and this energy is going to be responsible for triggering or allowing these certain reactions to happen. These are not the only reactions, bear that in mind, these functions. There are other ones. These are just some very key ones that you guys should get in your mind, your big brains, okay? So now, that's great. So now we understand why we need cell respiration, what the purpose is, right? Getting this right currency. We know now why ATP is useful, why it is the currency of our cell, and how it works vaguely. So now, let's actually get into talking about the process of cell respiration. So right now here, again, we got Mike Tyson. So now he's got his gloves or whatnot, and he's going to go box. Now, boxing is a very intense sport, right? You're going to use a lot of energy. So he starts boxing, and what's going to happen in his body? What can ensure that he can keep fighting, that he doesn't run out of energy? What's going to make sure he has enough ATP so that his muscles can contract? Because that's another function. ATP is useful to allow your muscles to contract. So how does his body make this ATP? Let's actually look at that now in detail. So first, if we come back to this part, we need glucose. Remember, how does glucose get into our cells again? We eat something, we digest it into glucose. Glucose gets absorbed into our bloodstream. Our bloodstream will carry it to our cells will take it in. Okay, so our cells now took it in. So now here we are inside a cell. So all this light bluish part is going to be our cytoplasm of our cell. And this right here is our mitochondria. And now we're going to go through this process quickly. So here we got glucose. So glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. So each edge here is 1 carbon. Don't worry too much about the structure. So it's a 6-carbon molecule, glucose. Now, how does this process work? So very first thing that happens is inside our cytoplasm. Okay, give me 1 second here. Sorry, I'm just moving something. Okay, so the very first thing that happens is something called glycolysis. It makes sense because we're splitting glucose. Glyco stands for glucose, and lysis means to split something. So we're splitting this glucose, and where's it happening? In the cytoplasm. Now, interestingly, to trigger this reaction to happen, okay, because bear in mind, there's a lot of all these steps are enzyme catalyzed, meaning I don't know if you've learned about enzymes, but there's a chapter on enzymes, and we know that enzymes trigger all the reactions in metabolic reactions in our body to happen. They're little things that speed up reactions. So for this reaction, we need ATP. We need 2 ATPs, in fact. So 2 ATPs, currencies are used to allow this reaction to happen. You don't need to know what enzymes are used. Just bear in mind that generally these steps are enzyme catalyzed. They need enzymes to happen. Okay, so ATP is used to allow this reaction to happen, 2 ATPs. So that's kind of weird. You're like, what? Aren't we trying to make ATP? But now the very first step, we're using ATP. You're right? It's weird, but bear with me because you'll see where all the ATP is made. So ATP is invested. So we're investing 2 ATPs, and then that glucose splits into 2 molecules. two 3-carbon molecules. That makes sense, right? Because glucose is 6 carbon, so if we split it by glycolysis into 2 molecules, those 2 molecules will be 3-carbon molecules, right? Now, in this process of the final splitting, initially we had to invest 2 ATPs, but once the splitting actually happened, we release 4 ATPs, okay? So overall, think about it. We made a net 2 ATPs because we used 2 and we generated 4. So how many total new ones do we have? 2, right? I don't want you to worry too much about the numbers because that's really more of an HL thing. If you can, it'd be good, I guess, but don't worry too much about that. Just get the overall idea here. Now we have something interesting. Under 2 circumstances. So first, pyruvate, this molecule, can undergo one of 2 following stages. If your body is low on oxygen, so say you're really struggling to get in air, or you've been doing exercise for a long time, your body is running out of oxygen, you're struggling to breathe very hard, you're doing very intense exercise. So if you're under that circumstance, then this pyruvate is going to undergo what's called anaerobic respiration. So this is respiration where it tries that happens when oxygen is low. Okay, so what can happen is 2 things. If you are an animal, so a human like us, say you're low on oxygen and something and you're still continuing this exercise, your pyruvate is going to be converted into lactate. Lactate is another 3-carbon molecule that's been modified a little bit. You don't need to worry about exactly what happens. Just know this pyruvate gets turned into lactate. This is the same as lactic acid, okay? So that's another name, lactic acid. We call this lactic acid fermentation. Now, this is what happens when you're exercising for a long time and your muscle starts burning. This burning feeling is this lactate building up inside your body, this acid building up inside your body, and it causes cramping and all that sort of stuff, right? But you've noticed this burning feeling goes away as soon as you stop curling those weights, as soon as you stop doing that intense exercise. That's because when you stop doing that intense exercise, your body can relax again and get enough oxygen to do the other process and not this one. So under low oxygens, this pyruvate can be turned into lactate in animals, so humans, whatever. Okay, very important. Now, you also need to know about what happens in yeast for some odd reason. So if you're not an animal and you're a yeast, which is a small kind of cell, kind of like a fungi, these produce, under anaerobic respiration, they produce alcohol, which is a 2-carbon molecule, and carbon dioxide. So you can see the 3-carbon molecule got split into a 2-carbon molecule and alcohol, and carbon dioxide. The other carbon was released as carbon dioxide. So we call this alcoholic fermentation, okay? Very, very important. So this is actually obviously how they make certain alcohols using yeast, because they just let it go. They let this yeast, they put it in very anaerobic conditions, very low oxygen conditions, and then it's forced to make alcohol. And that's kind of how they can do it, and we call it alcoholic fermentation. Also, interestingly, yeast is used in certain baking products because, look, under anaerobic conditions, it makes a lot of carbon dioxide, right? Pyruvate can convert it into carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is like air, so it can rise, it can expand. So this is what helps certain products like bread to rise in the oven, okay? Now, let's now go into the next part. So that was what happened. So let's recap. So we got glucose. In the cytoplasm, it can go glycolysis, where it gets split into 2 pyruvates. Pyruvate can either undergo anaerobic respiration if the oxygen is very low, or it can go aerobic respiration. So this is when oxygen is present, when oxygen is in sufficient supply. Okay, and we'll see exactly why oxygen really matters later. So the first stage that's going to happen now is this pyruvate is not going to stay in the cytoplasm anymore. It's now going to go into the mitochondria. So where does it go? So this is our mitochondria. We can see it has all these crazy little folds. So it's one outer membrane, then it's got this inner membrane, and then this light bluish area, we call this the matrix. And all these little folds, we call them cristae. Okay, so where is this pyruvate going? So for aerobic respiration, so when oxygen is high, it's going to go into the matrix. So it's going to go into the matrix of the mitochondria. And 3 steps need to happen. 3 steps are going to happen. The first step is called the link reaction. So this one is a step that's going to turn this pyruvate into a 2-carbon molecule. So notice here it's 3 carbon. Now we're going to turn it into a 2-carbon molecule. Where did the other carbon molecule go? Well, we released it as carbon dioxide, similar to this scenario here, right? So we released that carbon as carbon dioxide, but also we made another little thing here. This little thing, I'm putting it as a little ticket. You know those arcade tickets that you get? You can keep them and you can turn them in later after you played and trade them in for a prize, right? So think of it like that. Think of this molecule as a little ticket. For SL, you don't need to know what the real name is. For HL, when I make that video, you're going to see what this ticket's name really is. Just for now, for the concept, know that there's this little molecule made. It's like an arcade ticket, okay? So now the link reaction is over and we have this 2-carbon molecule. This 2-carbon molecule is now going to enter a second reaction, okay, which we call the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle, okay? The Krebs cycle is a crazy little cycle. It's got a lot of details that HL needs to know, but you guys don't need to know that much, so it's great for you guys. So this molecule will go in and a bunch of reactions will happen, and this Krebs cycle is going to release 3 important things. Carbon dioxide, just like the link reaction did, okay? It's going to release carbon dioxide. And this is interesting, right? Because when you do a lot of exercise, your body you start feeling like you got to inhale and exhale a lot, right? That's because partially you're trying to get in oxygen so that you can do cell respiration, and you're also trying to get rid of all this carbon dioxide that you're making as a byproduct, okay? So that's interesting why you inhale and exhale so much. Now, other than carbon dioxide, we also make some ATP. Yay, we got some more ATP. Now, and we make a lot of these little tickets, these arcade tickets. Now, finally, we get to the last stage of this aerobic respiration, which is called the ECT, electron transport chain. Okay, electron transport chain. And there's a lot that, and this one happens in these cristae. It happens throughout these little membranes, okay? Throughout these little membranes. That's where this last step happens. Now, this step is crazy because it produces, look, 30 to 34 ATPs. Where does these ATPs come from? They come from these tickets. These tickets that build up from the link reaction and the Krebs cycle, they will all go to these membranes and do this last step with this electron transport chain. And essentially, they're like those arcade tickets. They go to this little membrane, they go to this electron transport chain, and they trade themselves in to become ATPs. They want this final prize, which is ATP. So in exchange for giving these little arcade tickets, we get ATP. A lot of them. See, a lot of them. You can see almost no ATP is made during glycolysis, and most of it, almost all of it, is made during aerobic respiration, specifically the electron transport chain. Now notice also, one more thing that we make is water. Where the heck is water coming from? And why did oxygen matter in the first place? Right, let's get to that. So oxygen is very important, specifically for this last step on the electron transport chain. These little tickets, what they do is, they are a molecule, and they're going to drop off a bit of themselves, a little bit of electrons. Don't worry about understanding that. HL needs to understand that. Just know that oxygen is very important because in this last step, it is considered the final electron acceptor. So it's going to accept a little molecule from these little guys. So it's going to accept this little molecule, this electron, and in exchange, when it accepts that electron, it becomes water. So as oxygen accepts that electron, it becomes water. So at the end of this aerobic respiration, a lot of these oxygens are required because they are required to do this trade-in so that these tickets can become ATP. So they're there, they're waiting for these little tickets, they accept them, and as they accept them, they become water. So that's how a lot of water builds up as well in aerobic respiration. So that's very important. That's where that's where oxygen matters. If oxygen wasn't there, then we wouldn't be able to complete this last step, and we wouldn't be able to form all this ATP. Because oxygen is our final electron acceptor. Just remember those 3 words. Final electron acceptor. Don't worry about understanding it. It's not required for this level. In HL, there will be more information on that. Okay, awesome. Let's recap it real quick, and I just want to say one last thing. So you need to know, as a side note, roughly 30 to 40% of the available energy in our glucose, right? Because with cell respiration, we're trying to break this down to make as much energy in the form of ATP as possible, right? But note that only 30 to 40% of the energy stored in glucose is actually released as ATP. The rest, 60 to 70%, is actually just lost as heat, right? And that makes sense because when you're running around, your body's heating up, you're losing a lot of heat because your body is generating heat as it's trying to break down the glucose to form energy. Because all you're doing during exercise is your body wants to make ATP, right? Mike Tyson here is trying to make ATP so he can punch again. But as a byproduct in a way, by making ATP, your body makes a lot of heat. And so he's going to heat up, right, as a consequence. So know that not only is ATP made, but also heat energy. Not only chemical energy in the form of ATP, but also heat energy, okay? That's very important. Okay, so overall, we got glucose. From here, we can either go anaerobic respiration, so so note that glycolysis happens in both anaerobic and aerobic, okay? It's not just anaerobic or just aerobic. Glycolysis, this first step, needs to happen for both anaerobic and aerobic. So if you need to explain anaerobic respiration or aerobic respiration, always start with glucose and then it starts off the same. They both start off with glycolysis, and then from this point on, they're different. Then anaerobic respiration will go this way, or aerobic respiration will go this way. Okay, so but note they both start off with glycolysis. Okay, that's very important. So now here we have the cellular respiration equation, okay? Specifically aerobic, right? We're specifically focusing on this one where all the energy is made. So we can see here from this equation we have basically what happens during cell respiration is glucose reacts with oxygen, right? Where was oxygen useful again? Here at the last step, at the electron transport chain as the final electron acceptor. So those two will react together with a bunch of enzymes, right? Remember, enzymes catalyze all of these little steps. And they form as a product carbon dioxide. Why? Look, carbon dioxide is constantly made. And water. Why? Because water here is made at the end when oxygen accepts that electron, right? So water is made, carbon dioxide made, and ATP is made. ATP, not only ATP, but also heat energy. So two kinds of energy is made. Now, you might be like, okay, what about these little tickets? What about them? Technically, they are not a product because they're made here, but then immediately used there. So they don't build up. They're like an intermediate product. Carbon dioxide is made and nothing happens with it. So it's a product. ATP is made, nothing happens with it. It's a product. Same with water. But this one, it's made, but then immediately used in the next step. So therefore, we don't consider it a final product. Okay? So you can see from this equation, that's why it makes sense. And why is there a 6 and a 6 and a 6 here? It's just in chemistry, we like to balance the equations because we need to make sure that there's the same amount of carbon on this side of the equation and the same amount of carbon on that side. So if we count them, look, C6. There's 6 carbons on this side, so there must be 6 on this side. Where are they? 6C. Okay, so don't worry, it's a chemistry thing. Just for you guys, you gotta just memorize how to write it. Don't worry about the mechanism or anything like that, why we're balancing it like this. Okay, awesome. Real close. I just need to highlight this for you guys. Okay, so there's 2 key words you need to know. Again, this is going to be much more explained in HL, but what you should know is that in this reaction, there's an oxidation reaction happening and a reduction reaction happening. An oxidation reaction is a kind of chemical reaction that happens, and what happens in this reaction is the products have a higher energy. I mean, the reactants have a higher energy than the products, and that makes sense because we know that glucose has a lot of energy stored inside it, and we want to release it as ATP. So this glucose has a lot of energy, and we can see it gets converted into carbon dioxide. So it's an oxidation reaction because the reactant is more unstable. It's higher energy than the product. The product is more stable, lower energy. Whereas reduction is the opposite. When the reactant has lower energy than the product has higher energy. So you don't go ham on this. This is really going to be emphasized a lot in HL. I just want you to be aware of these 2 words, oxidation and reduction, okay? And just this little sentence will be enough, okay? And because they both happening in the same general reaction, because this right here is cellular respiration, because they're both happening, we call this a redox reaction because there's reduction happening and there's oxidation happening. They always happen at the same time. When one molecule undergoes oxidation, that means another one must go undergo reduction. And really, this is not going to make sense to you, and that's completely that I understand that completely, because there's not enough of an explanation given to you guys at standard level. So just know very little like this, what I wrote here, and that's fine. But for HL, you'll see, guys, you need to know a lot. You'll need to understand this a lot more. Okay, awesome. So here we have a summary of anaerobic and aerobic respiration in the table in case they ask you guys to write out and distinguish between these two. So here we got it. Anaerobic respiration requires glucose. Aerobic requires, so they both need glucose. Like I said, remember, they both start off with glucose that undergo glycolysis, and then from pyruvate, they undergo different directions. Okay, so anaerobic, because they don't need oxygen. Aerobic needs oxygen. Anaerobic occurs only in the cytoplasm. Aerobic goes into the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. Both places are needed. Their mechanism is slightly different. They start off the same. Glucose is split into two molecules of pyruvate. See, glucose is split into two molecules of pyruvate, but then from there, they're different. For anaerobic, for animals, it will form lactic acid, whereas for yeast, it will form alcohol and carbon dioxide. And then for aerobic, the pyruvate will enter the link reaction, then the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. Now, anaerobic produces so little ATP. 2, remember? Let me show you. You can see here 2 is invested, 4 is made. So a net gain of 2 ATPs because no more is made here. So only 2 ATPs is made in anaerobic respiration. Okay, very little. Whereas aerobic respiration makes many, 30 to 34, lots of ATP. And then final products of anaerobic is ATP and lactate in humans. We only really care about humans, so don't worry too much about yeast. Okay? ATP, again, because of the glycolysis. And then final products of aerobic respiration. If you remember the equation, you remember the products. Carbon dioxide, water, and energy in the form of ATP and heat. Okay, great. Make sure you know this. This can be a very big question of 8 marks or something. Okay, finally, what affects cell respiration? This is the last bit, then we do some questions, and then you guys got it done. This will be a quick one. So what affects cell respiration? So first of all, I want to talk about this one first, the type of cell that does it. So some cells in our body, like our muscles, need a lot more ATP. Think about it. You're moving the whole time. Your muscles are contracting constantly. To contract your muscles, you need ATP. So these kind of cells need way more ATP. So they're constantly doing cell respiration. So the type of cell affects cell respiration. There are some cells that don't do much cell respiration because they're not very active. They don't need that much money. They don't need that much money to do things. So depending on the type of cell, the cell respiration rate will be affected. Okay, what about this? Glucose. Glucose concentration affects cell respiration. Why? Think about the equation. If you have a lot of glucose, then it means you have a lot of reactants. That means your body has so much of it that it needs to use it. So if you eat a lot of glucose, your body's going to want to use it. So automatically, just by having a lot of this reactant, you're going to do cell respiration a little bit more than someone who eats less glucose. Okay, and therefore you're going to make more ATP and that kind of thing. Okay. Next, heat or temperature. Temperature also affects cell respiration. This one is quite interesting, and if you guys watch the enzyme video, this one will make even more sense to you guys. So temperature is interesting because remember I said that all of these reactions are enzyme catalyzed. So an enzyme is making these steps happen, right? An enzyme like this one. We know that enzymes depend a lot on temperature. So an enzyme has an optimal temperature at which it works at. If the temperature goes too high, then you break the enzyme, because an enzyme is just a protein, remember? So you may denature the enzyme, and if you denature the enzyme, then cell respiration will decrease because the enzymes don't work anymore that's supposed to catalyze those reactions. The same thing, when it gets cold, then the reactants move more slowly, right? Because heat increases kinetic energy. So if it gets very cold, the molecules move more slowly, so they collide less frequently. And when they collide less frequently, then less reactions tend to happen. So cell respiration will be a little bit slower. Okay, and then last one here is going to be oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when you have a lot of oxygen, then of course you can do more cell respiration because oxygen is needed to complete, remember here, oxygen is needed to accept that final electron to make the final ATP. So if you have more oxygen, then of course you can do more cell respiration, okay? If you have less oxygen, then you're going to do less cell respiration. Now, what about this one? If you have carbon dioxide, so if you have low carbon dioxide, then that's going to increase cell respiration, because if you have low carbon dioxide, then your body's going to be like, oh, we have low of this, we need to increase it. And then one way to increase this carbon dioxide is to do cell respiration, to increase it, okay? To make these two molecules react and make more carbon dioxide. So that's important. So high oxygen can trigger increased cell respiration. Low carbon dioxide can trigger increased cell respiration. The cell type and temperature as long with glucose concentration. So think about it already. Three of these two, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and glucose, you can already see just from the equation, okay? So that's important. Know these factors, these 5 factors that affect cell respiration. Now let's go into some questions. So these should be pretty straightforward if you've understood everything that I've talked about so far. Which process produces the most ATP per molecule of glucose? Anaerobic? Nope, definitely not anaerobic. They make like 2 total. Aerobic? Ooh, yeah, definitely aerobic respiration. And so they're saying aerobic respiration in bacterial cells. It doesn't matter if it happens in an animal or a bacterial cell. Aerobic respiration produces the most ATP. Okay, glycolysis? No, because glycolysis only produces 2 net ATPs. We saw, right? If we go back here, 2 net ATPs is made in glycolysis, so not much at all. The formation of lactic acid in human muscle cell? No, because that's anaerobic, right? Lactic acid is made by anaerobic respiration. So the answer is definitely B. What happens during the pathway of glycolysis? Glucose is broken down into pyruvates. That's true, right? Carbon dioxide is produced. No. Remember? The glucose, the 6-carbon glucose, is split into 2 pyruvates. No carbon dioxide is made. More ATP is consumed than is produced. No. 2 ATP is consumed and 4 is produced. So more ATP is produced than consumed. Okay, remember that. Lactic acid is produced. No. Lactic acid is produced after glycolysis, not during glycolysis. So that's A. What is the definition of cell respiration? It's the controlled, that's very important, controlled release of energy in the form of ATP from organic compounds. See, glucose, fatty acids, those are all organic compounds. So don't get confused when you see this. So it doesn't have to be just glucose. It can be any kind of organic compound. So the answer here is definitely A. It's not B. The process is used in some organisms to produce their own organic substances. No, you don't produce organic substances. You break them down in cell respiration. Photosynthesis can produce organic substances. That's the opposite of cell respiration. This process that uses ATP to produce organic compounds. Nope, that is photosynthesis, not cell respiration. The controlled release of energy, that's true. During food production, no. Cell respiration breaks down food, doesn't produce food. Okay, so the answer is definitely A. Last one here. Which compound is a waste product of anaerobic respiration in humans? What do you say? In humans, it's going to be lactate, remember? Lactate is made in humans. In yeast, it is going to be ethanol and carbon monoxide. And glycolysis produces pyruvate, okay? So that's it for this video. I really hope it will help you out. It's quite tricky and there's a lot of things to it, but I hope the diagrams and things clears it up for you, makes it easier. Focus on the right things. Whatever I said, you shouldn't focus on too much because it's an HL thing. Listen to my word, it's true. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that video and see you in the next one.